All right, so we've made it to essay structure. The thesis of your paper is a really important part of how you organize the ideas that come after. Most analytical essays are going to ask you to follow the standard structure, where you have your introduction first, body paragraphs after, and a conclusion. The introduction has a very specific job. The job is to announce the topic with a statement of subject, focus the discussion, limit the scope of the topic to be examined, and make the reader feel as if they're about to read the best essay on that subject that they've ever read before. When I was in high school, my English instructor talked about the introduction like a funnel. Now, your English instructor may have done the same, basically thinking about this large inverted triangle where the broadest ideas are at the top and then the most specific ideas are at the bottom. This works fairly well if you have a very graphic mind. If you're already somebody who likes to draw and write and thinks of things in pictures, thinking of an introduction like a funnel can help you organize your ideas. However, that doesn't necessarily work for very long, particularly when you start to get into the arguments that we deal with at the college level. I'm going to talk a little bit about statement of subjects, how we focus the discussion, and how we write a thesis statement here in a moment. But let me first say that in an English essay, you do also need to introduce the title and the author of the novel or poem you are discussing before you provide the thesis and the main points that you're going to use to support that thesis. A statement of subject is a general statement, usually, that announces the topic to the reader. Really good statement of subjects are never huge and vague. They're usually still fairly specific, and for that reason, they're sometimes confused with being a thesis, but they're not. A thesis is usually a lot more specific and detailed than a statement of subject. Taking a look at the two examples on the screen, the first example is fairly poor, but people often use it when they can't think of anything else to say. They say things like, "In this essay, I am going to." And yeah, that's an announcement, but you're breaking a few of those earlier rules. You're using I, and then you're referring to the essay itself. And typically that's not always bad, but it usually leads to a fairly vague statement of subject, as this one does. In this essay, I'm going to discuss violence in hockey. Okay. It's still kind of out there, and we need it to have a little bit more detail and focus. Better, the non-playing public often misunderstands the purpose of roughness in hockey. Oh, okay. Not necessarily violence, but roughness. Violence implies you're cracking somebody's head open. Roughness is the jostling and checking that happens in a game that can lead to violence, but doesn't always. So your statement of subject shouldn't be very huge and vague and general. It should be still fairly specific and guide the reader to your point. As you begin to focus your discussion in your introduction, you want to make your main arguments or your main thesis points. For example, of the many qualities that combine to make a good nurse, the three most important are strength, intelligence, and compassion. So we know, once we get into the body paragraphs of the paper, that this paper is going to discuss these important elements. The main points, or the thesis, need to be very clear and organized. Sometimes this is also called an essay plan, because there's typically 2 or 3 things that are introduced in the introduction that are then unrolled in more detail in the body paragraphs. So it operates as a plan. X because A, B, and C is the most common method or most common formula for building a thesis essay plan. In this method, X is your main idea, the idea you're going to prove. A, B, and C are your supporting points. So the supporting points are the three topics that in detailed discussion are going to absolutely show that your X is correct. Here's an example. Cats make the best pets for the elderly because they provide comfort and are easy to care for. So the X is cats make the best pets for the elderly. A, B, and C are they provide comfort and are easy to care for. This one only has two, so it has an A and a B. Most essays have at least two, so they'll have an A and a B. Some essays will have 3, 4, or 5 supporting points, depending on the length of the paper. Here's another example. If we read through this, homelessness is an intolerable situation in a prosperous society. That's our opening general statement. It isn't too general. For example, homelessness is bad. That would be too general. Of course it is. Everybody kind of agrees with that. Homelessness is an intolerable situation in a prosperous society gives us a little more insight into the direction of the paper. Then the person begins to give us their A, their B, and their C, the main topics they're going to discuss later. Government subsidies continue to provide inadequate support for Canadian homeless people as well as those on the verge of homelessness. Okay, that's the first idea that they're going to use to prove their X. Despite the annual increases in national homelessness, politicians' recent proposals to cut taxes for social aid can only signal the ongoing neglect of some of society's more neglected citizens. So here, our A, our first topic, is government subsidies. Later on in the paper, this person is going to talk about how government subsidies are not enough. Then, this person is going to talk about the national increases in homelessness. So they're going to look at some statistics on homelessness across the country. After that, they're going to talk about what politicians are saying. Politicians are going to cut taxes for social aid. So, in that body paragraph, closer to the end of the paper, this person's really going to drive home their point that nothing's being done to help the homeless. Indeed, their X, their main point, is that society is continuing to neglect the most neglected citizens already. So it's getting worse and worse and worse. So the main point here is actually at the end. Sometimes this is also called A, B, and C, so X, which is also a formula you can use if you want your main thesis point, that big X that you're going to prove, at the end of your introduction. Here's another example. In Jane Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice, 1803, Elizabeth Bennet provides the natural foil to Fitzwilliam Darcy's elegant dark hero. The purpose of this dichotomy is to explore how two characters can resolve their apparent differences in class in order to bring the novel to its satisfying conclusion, marriage. To that end, Austen uses manners, conflicts in communication, and letters to resolve the foil. Here, we have an opening general statement. Sorry about that. We have an opening general statement right here at the top. Then we have our X. What's the purpose of this dichotomy? Well, marriage. What does Austen do to get us there? Austen uses these three things: manners, A, conflicts in communication, B, and letters to resolve the foil. I'm going to turn off my devices. Haha. That's going to be the test to see if you listen to this. At what point did my phone ring? The body paragraph structure with a formula like x because a, b, and c looks like this. We have our introduction at the start with our thesis, and then our 3 main points. The first section of your paper is going to prove that main point. In this first section, you may have multiple paragraphs. You might have 2 or 3 points that you need for section A to make section A's argument hold. Similarly with section B and section C. So you're going to have those ideas in the same order that they're introduced in the introduction. The introduction provides the roadmap that the reader is going to go along. The topic sentences for each section will also use keywords that will keep the reader on track. After you go through your main body points, you're going to provide an exhaustive conclusion. In your introduction, you want to make sure that you're not introducing too much counter-argument. If it's not an argumentative paper, generally avoid it. You can use important definitions if they're significant to the paper. Gestures to authority are sometimes important as well if you're discussing someone or a theory that is important to mention. Anecdotes, quick funny stories, can also be a nice guide to the reader, but they're not always necessary. Similarly with unusual or unexpected facts. By the time you get to your conclusion, you're going to want to make sure that you've covered all the main points that you've hoped to cover in your body paragraphs. We'll talk more about body paragraphs and what they should contain in an academic paper in the future. In the case of a conclusion, you want to make sure in your college papers that you're providing an exhaustive conclusion. And of course, exhaustive conclusions are kind of exhausting. Most people write them last, and they're usually just tired of talking about it at that point. An exhaustive conclusion should summarize the previous discussion using different, stronger wording, and I usually recommend that you sleep on it first. If you finish writing your paper, sleep, wake up the next day, and write a conclusion just from memory without looking at your paper, you can usually find a new, innovative way, an Oprah Winfrey exciting way, to say what you need to say without feeling like you're beating a dead horse. Suggestive conclusions are rarely required. Sometimes if you're asked to suggest a solution to a particular problem, it may be requested. However, just make sure that it is requested before you provide one. In a conclusion, you're not going to introduce any new information, and generally speaking, you avoid quotes, unless the quote actually sums up things that you just said. Please make sure that you review the contents of this essay before you begin writing your first. If you have any questions, please post them in the discussion forum or send me a message and I'll be happy to answer.